Communication. We all communicate every day and we all screw it up at least some of the time. And that's just on the personal level. Being an effective communicator is a given, though, if you want to be a highly effective, remarkable leader. So today we're talking about how to transform how we talk and interact and listen, even though we do all of those things all day long. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, a very exciting live episode of this podcast because I'm talking with our guest on the publication day of his book. More about that in a second. But if you're listening to this podcast, it's not publication day of the book, but you could have been here live and you can be here for future lives. And to make sure you know about when those are and how to get connected for all of that, you can just join our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Take your pick, whichever works for you, because these lives take place on both of those channels and others as well. Today's episode is brought to you by Remarkable Development Sessions. A Remarkable Development Session is a webinar for a new world. We know that we learn in interaction with others, but in a fractured, increasingly virtual world, the workshop experience has been shifted to a focus on simply delivering the content and leaving the application to you as an individual. And even if you love learning from webinars, you've likely thought that there has to be a better way, and we've tried to create that better way to make a webinar far better than it's ever been before. And so you can learn more about what we're doing and our upcoming sessions by going to kevineikenberry.com/remarkable development. And when you do that, you will have the chance to learn what we're doing there. I hope you'll do that. Now I'm going to bring in our guest. There he is with his smiling face waving at you. My guest today on Pub Day is Chuck.
Pub Day.
Yeah. Chuck is a highly sought after thinker, coach, and teacher in the areas of organizational strategy, human dynamics, and leadership communication excellence, our topic today. He has spent 25 years as a business and personal consultant and trusted advisor to leaders in high-profile companies across industries. His methods are anchored in years of leading-edge research, theoretical development, and the practical application of the foundations of conversations. He is the author of the brand new book, The Art of Conscious Conversations, Transforming How We Talk, Listen, and Interact. He is currently working as an advisor with leaders and their teams at Google, Ford, DTE Energy, and Tesla. His client list has also included others, including the Harvard Business School, Toyota, the Detroit Mayor's Office, General Motors, Shell, and Chrysler Motor Company. He lives in New England with his wife, Kata, an artist, and though he's not there today, because today he's in Detroit. And he's our guest. Chuck, welcome. Glad to have you, sir.
Well, thanks for having me. And what a special thing to be here on Pub Day. It's the most celebration. It's the most celebration I'll get today because the rest of the day I'm with the team in Detroit working hard.
Well, make sure they know it's Pub Day. At least they can maybe they can give you a little appreciation. I told you before we hit record that it is, when you have a book come out and you see it in your hands is a day, but then the day that you know that other people can have it in their hands is a pretty special day. So I'm pleased to be with you on this day. So I'm guessing, Chuck, that when you were 8 years old, you didn't necessarily think that you'd do the work that you're doing and that you have published a book. So tell us a little bit about the journey that gets you to here in short form.
Okay, it's a long story, so a very short form of a long story. I was a musician first at a young age, and in bands and big bands, and cut records and taught. And I transitioned a long story into architecture, and ended up moving to Boston to go to architecture school. And I practiced architecture for 20 or 25 years. And through there's some stories in the book, problems we had inside the firm with partners, we got help. I fell in love with one of the consultants' work, not her. And it just sparked a curiosity in me, because I'm sort of interested in philosophy, spirituality, conversations, and her work really sparked lit all those sparks. And so I spent 4 years retraining myself. I studied the ontology of language and mediation. And 4 years later, I changed careers and set off on a new venture. And then I'm here now 25 years later.
And so he starts out as a musician and an architect, and now he's working with like every major car company in the world. Like, how did it end up being that you started? How did you end up working so much in the auto industry?
Oh, that was really a stroke of luck. One of my coaches inside the program I did, the Ontology of Language, Leslie Pollitt was her name. After we were done with that program, she was working with Fred Kaufman and Peter Senge at MIT around the Society for Organizational Learning. And they were starting a new transformational leadership program with probably, I'm not sure how many companies were involved, but the companies bought into the program. And so they had this program where they had 30 leaders coming from all over the country, from different companies, where we could get our hands on them for a period of 6 to 8 months. And they asked me to join them. And that was really just a thrill and a way that launched me into the career that I now have.
That's awesome. So the core of this new book, The Art of Conscious Conversations, are 4 types of conversations. And so that's probably the logical place to start. We don't have time, obviously, to unpack all of it. People are going to need to go buy a copy of the book, and we'll tell them how they can do that in a little while. But at a very high level, what do you mean by types of conversations, and what are these 4 types?
Okay. So what in my studies of language, it's the power of language. It sort of like deconstructs how language works. And part of that is understanding how conversations work. And the 4 conversations that I'm most interested in, and there's a few more, but they're sort of subsets. I consider them subsets. Were a way for me to take a lot of complexity around conversations, which is 1, very personal work. 2, how do we interact with other people? 3, how do we create? And 4, we make promises and commitments all day long. And each of those areas is what the conversations cover. And each conversation, storytelling, collaboration, creativity, and commitments, right? Each of those has tools embedded in them that can help us manage each type. And of course, then they all intersect and weave into each other. But if we can take it apart and understand them, then we have a much better chance of mastering each one and also working them so they work well together. That makes sense?
So, yeah, absolutely. So my question is this. So, I mean, I've had the chance to read the book, and others are just joining us. But when you hear those 4 types, the storytelling conversation, the collaborative conversation, the creative conversation, and the commitment conversation, the question I would have for you is, and it's an overgeneralization, I realize, but
Sure.
Which is the one that leaders mess up the most?
I'll ask you if I can counter your question with a different question. Which 2
Sure.
do leaders mess up the most?
Which 2, Chuck, do leaders mess up the most?
Yeah. So we, and then leaders in the default, are humans too, right? So we love storytelling. We love to figure things out. We love our perspective, and our ego gets involved because then we are like, I know I have the right answer. In fact, we're educated to raise our hand because we're the smartest one in the room. Same thing happens in business. We're rewarded for having the answer in the room. So storytelling is a beautiful thing, but it's also a trap, because once we get some power and some authority and we have our perspective, we just want to go out there and prove our point, right? That's a mistake.
And in fact, not only has that been what we've gotten rewarded for, but in many cases, that's what we think we're supposed to do as the boss, right? Like, there's, even if we're not sure it's the right answer, like, that's what we think is our job, right?
That's right. Yeah, and God forbid I would be wrong, or I'd love to say we need to learn to say I don't know, because the higher you get in an organization, the less likely you are to have the answer for all things that matter, right?
By definition, right?
Yeah. So there's story, and then the last conversation is commitment conversations, and that is where the action is. That's where you say, okay, who's going to do what by when and why and how, right? And the reason I'm picking on these two is not because we do them the worst, but because we're addicted to them. We're addicted to our stories, and we're addicted to our commitment conversations, which is, okay, let's make a decision and get on with it, right? And so those two things drive a lot of meetings, drive a lot of unvetted decisions. That what they do is they shut down the other two conversations, which are the meatiest conversations where we get to exchange ideas and disagree and wrestle with something and then create possibilities.
So, wow, there's so much that we could talk about there. When you think about that addiction that we have as leaders, I don't think it's only as leaders, but certainly as leaders.
That's right. No, we
the storytelling piece and the commitment piece, and we leave out the middle, which ends up making us the focal point, right?
Yep.
By focusing on the first and last one, we end up being the focal point. And there's been so much written, Chuck, over the last 20 years about more participative, more facilitative sorts of leadership approaches. Are we getting any better at that?
Yeah, I think we are. And so I like for every conversation, I introduce sort of the fundamentals. And then I love to talk about what your preferences are for any conversation as a pattern. That, we're our pattern to behave and react in certain ways and participate in conversation in certain ways. I like the word pattern because it takes a little bit of the judgment out. We can be a little bit more an impartial witness to our pattern, right? Without sort of beating ourselves up. And so that's important because those two conversations, we are getting better because there's a lot more talk about psychological safety. There's a lot easing of the burden of leaders having to have all the answers. But it is a hell of a hard pattern to break when you're in the thick of something, right?
Especially, like, it's easy intellectually for us to sit here today and say, oh yeah, I need to get more collaboration going. Like, and few people disagree with that intellectually. It's doing it in the moment, right? That's the challenge. So I want to come back to that. A couple of things have shown up in the comments that I wanted to comment on, and we're hearing that storytelling is a fundamental part of being human. Agreed, and others are agreeing with that point. And yet both of these comments are really about, well, if we go back here, that storytelling is a fundamental part of being a human. That's how we make sense of the world, right? And I think we would both agree that using stories as leaders can help us be better communicators. But what you and I are talking about are the stories in our own heads, right? And how those are where we can get messed up a bit. In fact, I want to talk a little bit about the fact that maybe the challenge, and you talk about it in the book, about is it emotion, is it fact, is it opinion, and how does all that relate to our stories? So do you want to talk to that for a second?
Sure. So storytelling is a beautiful thing. I mean, all those people are 100% right. I mean, think about the lessons we learn and the pleasure we get from reading fiction. That's all storytelling, and we're being told stories that somehow resonate or teach us lessons. And then we bring it home, and what happens is, from very early on with our families and our cultures, we adopt standards, we adopt preferences, we adopt biases, we adopt prejudices, right? And for the most part, we adopt them unknowingly. I mean, not fully consciously. It's like, oh yeah, that's what I learned in my family. And so I'm not criticizing that, but I'm saying when those stories that we hold about ourselves, or we hold about other people, or we hold about our community or our church or our work, right? When we hold them as truth, that's when we're in trouble. We're in a slippery slope, because our stories contain facts and opinions and they generate emotions, right? But they aren't the truth. And so to one analogy I use that works well with the collaboration conversation also is like, if I go into a conversation with a story that I believe is true, I'm entering with a fist. I'm entering with a closed mind and a closed fist, because this is the truth and I'm going to defend it to death, right?
Yep.
Well, if we can hold our stories more lightly, don't give them up, but hold them lightly, because in each story, under every opinion, we have those things, the concerns, there's power issues, there's standards that we never even chose that we unconsciously hold, and we have desires. So all that stuff is woven into our stories about ourselves and others, that if we can hold them more lightly, we have a better chance of engaging and actually then getting other people to meet us there. Does that make sense?
It does 100%. And it makes me think of an example that I bet you and I've had the same conversation with clients. I'll bet. And it goes back to when the story that we hold about raising our hand means that we have an answer. Raising our hand says that we want to participate. Raising our hand says we are engaged, right?
Yep.
And so oftentimes I'll be with a group and a leader will say, well, did people engage? And I'll say, yeah, they were engaged. Most everyone was really engaged. They said, well, not everyone said anything. And I say, so let's talk about that, because engaged doesn't have to necessarily mean talking in every case at every moment, right? And so that's just a difference. And so let's hold on to that truth a little bit more, that story a little bit more carefully, and then maybe we can look at that. I want to transition, because you started to mention the idea of the collaboration conversations. I want to actually read something, everybody, from the book. So Chuck can bask in his own words here for a second, and then you can comment on this when I finish, because I absolutely love this. In our interactions, we aren't transmitting and receiving data like TVs and radios, signal sent, signal received. Unlike radio antenna, our reception of others' words is rarely straightforward because of our big, beautiful, filtering, sense-making brain. When a friend or colleague or stranger says, do you believe that? Within milliseconds, your interpretation of their words plays out in your mind. Whether it's person to person, emails, texts, etc., what we say isn't what someone else hears, and what someone else says isn't what we hear. Talk about that. It's so true. And yet in the thick of it, as you said earlier, we forget that. So talk about that for a second.
Yeah, and that goes back to that in the beginning of the book. I think I say we're like fish in water. We're like human beings in conversation, or human beings in language, right? So we forget that there's a huge filtering that goes on that helps keep us sane. It's a fundamental part of why we can exist, why we actually exist as human beings, and why we're smart, and how storytelling creates cultures, which creates progress. So, but we forget that with all these billions of data coming in, there's a filtering mechanism that is connecting our history and the current senses that we're getting, the emotions we're feeling, and then it's saying, oh, this is what's going on. And I like to think of how we can become aware of this on the funnel. So if you think about a funnel, three-dimensional, if you ever put a quarter in a science museum and it rolls down, by the time it gets to the bottom, it's going so fast you can't even, it's just a blur, right? Mm-hmm. So I like to think of when we are in a conversation, to know that, well, okay, we're getting filtered. We have an interpretation, but it's not like a radio signal. We aren't getting a direct interpretation, right? We're getting a filtered interpretation based on our history. And if we can catch ourselves and really realize that, right? Because there's two things that are going to happen. There's two extremes that happen. When something happens in a meeting or with a friend or with a boss where you're triggered, right? At the bottom of the funnel is some fear that is pulling you down that funnel, right? I'll look stupid. He doesn't believe me. I can't believe she said that to me. Whatever it is, it's that fundamental fear. That's fine. It is what it is. But it's that reaction that pulls us down the funnel, so we can't think clearly. We can't see clearly, right? If we can catch ourselves and we ask ourselves, oh, do I have it right? could I learn something here? If we can catch ourselves, then we can ask some questions, and maybe instead of contracting down the funnel, we can push ourselves up a little bit wider mind, a little bit more curiosity, and a little bit, distance from our position.
And like the quarter, slow ourselves down a little
That's
bit
right.
more, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you mentioned the metaphor in the book, which I absolutely loved, about the fish doesn't notice the water, and because they live in the water, and we don't notice the conversation because we live in conversation. And I think what this book does is help us do exactly what you said, step back, and sometimes hopefully we can do it in the moment, but even if not, when we look at it later. And I'm guessing, like me, oftentimes when you're coaching, you're basically getting people to look back and say, okay, so how else might you look at that? What other options are there to consider as to why the person did or said what they did or said, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we I think one thing that there's a balance to how we're taught to advocate and have the right position and defend it. One tool that we can that we need to adopt more is inquiry. We need to fall in love with questions. Like, I can't tell you how valuable it is to, like, even in a tension filled or a stressful situation, to stop yourself from reacting and ask some questions so you can better understand the other person. I think it was Covey who said, what was his saying? Seek first to
understand, then be understood, right?
Yeah. And the art there is, and that's great advice. The art, and what I do in the book, is those four components of everybody there's always power issues involved. Even with a friend, there's power issues involved. We all have desires. We're all doing our best given what we want for tomorrow. We have concerns and worries, and we have standards. And if we can, if it's very hard to do this, but if we can begin to understand just those four components, it helps us ask good questions. I can say, wow, help me understand that. I've never thought of it that way. So can you tell me how you're measuring success? Can you tell me what your basic concern is? And that begins to open a conversation. And that's where the collaborative conversation, where we can get smart together instead of shutting down or getting groupthink or getting stupid together.
Right. So there's a story in the book that I've never experienced it to this extreme, but I've certainly experienced it and seen it, and I want you to share it because I think it's so instructive for us as leaders. You've mentioned the word power a number of times here, and the reality is, as a leader, there's a power differential between us and others, and so the story of the pink Riata. Tell that story, because and as you listen, everybody, I want you to think about, when have you been on either side of this story? Because chances are you've been on both, and maybe as the leader you haven't even realized it yet. Tell us about the pink Riata.
Yeah, and it's pretty extreme example.
It is very extreme,
right. But the same dynamic happens in little tiny ways too. In every meeting, perhaps. So we'll get to that. So the pink Riata was the VP of one of the company's design studios, or he was vice president of a division of a particular car, vertical, and he was walking to lunch. Some of his direct reports and things, they were walking to lunch, and he casually, they're just joking around. He said, "Wow, I wonder what a pink Riata would look like." And they all crack up laughing, and they go off to lunch. And 3-4 months later, I might have the details wrong because it's been quite a few years. That's why I can talk about it. I think I'm not in hot water. But he is called to the design showroom, which is a confidential, private thing that you have to, have a meeting. You have to get permission to go there. He goes and he walks in, and there is a completely pink Riata. pink white walls, pink leather, pink car, pink steering wheel. And he was shocked. He literally couldn't believe what he was seeing. And when he told this story, it was, I used to do leadership courses with that company. When we told this story together, he called it the big wheel, little wheel. And he would draw a circle and say, well, okay, so here I am, the big wheel. I'm the big, big boss, right? And I go, wonder what a pink Riata would look like, right? And his little turn, all of a sudden, there's now wheels turning faster and wheels turning faster and wheels turning faster until people are actually on lathes and machinery making pink for the car. So we labeled that the power of 10, that every leader should know that their voice has the power of 10. If you say innocently with good intent, I think that's a really bad idea. Someone could interpret that through their filtering system and think, oh my God, I'm going to get fired. Right? And again, that happens in small ways, big ways. But the power of 10 is just to wake leaders up to say, be careful with your words. They matter. You have a responsibility, but you have a responsibility to deliver and be accountable, but you also have a responsibility to the well-being and the appreciation of your folks, because they will assign you that power, whether you like it or not.
And whether you're aware of it or not, right? Because as drastic and as amazing as that version of the story is, like I said, I've seen it over and over. And I think one of the reasons, Chuck, I asked you to share it, and I appreciate you doing that, mm-hmm. is that especially for leaders who haven't been in leadership roles as long, they don't realize how much their thoughts and actions are amplified, to your point. And I just thought it was a useful thing to share. I'm glad that you did that. So
just one of the consequences is, and there's a lot written about this, I've written some articles also about psychological safety, right? And it's that trap of leaders having to tell their position or say what their opinion is first, right? Because they want to have the right answer, or their abuse of their power of 10, or their ignorance of the power of their voice, that creates the environment, the culture that doesn't feel safe to speak up.
For sure. I often tell leaders, listen, you need to talk less and talk later. And if you do those two things, ask more, assert less, talk later, and you will start to get yourself past some of that stuff that's in our head, that's in our experience, is what we think good leaders are supposed to do, and all of that stuff. Before we start to round this out, Chuck, and head to the finish line and let you get back to your client work, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you kind of wished we had, or is there a question I didn't ask that you wish I would have?
I think we did a broad brush of the conversations, but the one conversation we didn't talk about was the creative conversation. And that's so linked when I talked about stories and commitments, and we missed the middle two, right? The collaborative conversation and the creative conversation are really interdependent on one another. And if you go into a conversation with an open hand to learn from others, and you get into that space where you're asking questions like, and I could say, wow, I never thought of it that way. Help me understand your thinking, right? When we're in that kind of conversation, there's a mutual learning that goes on. And what happens in that space is literally there's space in our brains that are opening up, because instead of being like this, we're like this, and space opens up and ideas bubble up. I mean, we've all experienced that, right? Where we don't have to just like say, we got to go this way. And if we're so stuck on the answer, we can't see all the other possibilities. So the creative conversation is about possibilities, trusting your intuition, and training your whole brain instead of just your intellectual, logical brain.
And the bubbles can only come up through when there's space, right?
Right.
If there's no space, there's no way for them to come through.
They're not going to find their way. Yeah.
They're not going to find their way. So changing the subject, Chuck, what do you do for fun?
Oh boy. Okay. So I like to garden. I love reading nonfiction. And I swim and walk for exercise. And I love nature. So I like getting outside and having hikes and walks and things. And I like to cook. Oh, and I'm still in a band. I still am in a band.
I was going to say, we got this far. You didn't get to mention a band. Hard to believe that you and the band. So, okay. So I can't open that door, everybody, or we'll never finish. But one of the things you mentioned was reading nonfiction. It's something certainly that is important and valuable and enjoyable to me as well. What's something, Chuck, that you're reading right now?
So the current book I'm reading is called The Zen of Therapy by Mark Epstein. He's a pretty well-published author, psychologist, and Zen Buddhist, he studies Zen Buddhism. And what I like about the book, I love Eastern philosophy, and it's been part of my life for many, many years. But he's trying to bridge the gap between therapy, which is therapy and Buddhism, where instead of just asking questions, we can get people to reconsider their thinking, to reconsider their story, and maybe reframe something in a new way. And so I like how he's trying to bridge those two. Another book that maybe people have read is Sapiens by Yuval Harari, because that book is so good at telling how stories evolved, how our brains evolved as human beings. And in fact, we have our cultures and we have our societies because we have this capability to tell stories.
Yep. And of course, the book that you want all of us to now be reading is right here. The Art of Conscious Conversations, Transforming How We Talk, Listen, and Interact. So Chuck, where can we learn more about you and your work and get a hold of this book?
Okay, that is available today online at Barnes & Noble and Amazon and all of that jazz. So that would be great if you could pick it up. There's an audio version as well. And my website is chuckwisner.com. And I'm on social media. I'm on Instagram, which is Chuck_Wisner. I'm on LinkedIn. So any of those places. And we'll see how the book does. I'm really excited to share it and see how people respond.
Chuckwisner.com, everybody. And so, Chuck, you and I are just about done, but I'm not done with all of you in the audience, because I have a question for you. Chuck said we need to ask more questions. And if you've been here before, I always, and always is a long time, but I always ask you this question. Now what? Okay. You heard the conversation. You got some ideas. Maybe you were taking notes. Maybe you're on your bike or in your car or whatever, and you couldn't take notes. But none of what you just got matters if you don't take some action. So the question is, what are you going to do with what you just got? Maybe it's thinking about the power that your voice has more than you realize. Maybe you say, hey, I need to re-fall in love with questions again. Maybe you need to think more about how to hold on to your stories more lightly or loosely. What is it that you take from this that you will apply? Because until you do that, none of it will really have had the impact that I know that both Chuck and I would like for it to have for you. So, Chuck, thanks so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you so much. And to read your book and as it turns out, unknowingly to me, to share part of your pub day, which is a big deal. So, thanks again for being here. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. So everybody, if you like this, there's a whole catalog. You can go back and find all sorts of great stuff. If you are watching or listening to this later on the podcast, we'll have links to some past episodes that you might find especially useful given this particular conversation. But we also want to look forward, because moving forward every week, just like there has been, every week in the future, there'll be another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I hope you'll join me then. And until then, we'll see you.